Welcome back to Mythology. Last time we were in ancient Greece, standing in the stone forest at the edge of the world, learning why you should never look directly at certain kinds of pain. Today we go further back. Much further back. We are going to a place that most people have never thought about as the origin of everything. A land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. A civilization so ancient that when the ancient Greeks were still learning to read and write, this place had already been a thriving literary culture for 1,000 years. We are going to Mesopotamia, to the land that is modern Iraq, to the city of Uruk, which archaeologists believe was one of the first true cities in human history. And we are going to meet the oldest named hero in all of recorded literature. His name was Gilgamesh, and he asked a question that every human being who has ever lived has eventually asked. In some version, in some language, in some quiet moment when the weight of being alive becomes almost too much to bear. What happens when we die? And is there any way to stop it? This is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first great story ever written down by the human hand. Older than the Iliad by 1,000 years. Older than the Bible's oldest books. Carved into clay tablets in a script called cuneiform, the wedge-shaped impressions left by a reed pressed into wet clay, baked hard by the sun, and preserved by the very disasters that buried them. We almost lost this story entirely. For 2,000 years, it was completely unknown to the outside world. The tablets sat under the rubble of ancient libraries, under the desert sand of what is now Iraq, perfectly preserved precisely because they were made of baked clay rather than perishable paper or papyrus. When archaeologists began excavating in the 19th century and scholars began to decode cuneiform writing, they found fragments of something extraordinary. A story, an epic, a hero, a flood, a plant at the bottom of the sea that granted eternal life. They found the oldest mirror humanity ever made, and when they looked into it, they saw themselves staring back. Let us begin at the beginning. Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, and the texts describe him in a way that immediately signals we are in the presence of myth rather than history, though some scholars believe a real king named Gilgamesh may have ruled Uruk around 4,700 years ago. The epic calls him 2/3 god and 1/3 man. His mother was the goddess Nin's son. His father was a human priest-king. He was physically extraordinary. The tablets describe him as 11 cubits tall, which would make him nearly 5.5 meters, about 18 feet. His chest was described as 9 spans across. He was armored with beauty. When he appeared, people stared as they stare at a god. And he was, at the beginning of the story, a terrible king. Gilgamesh in his youth was driven by an excess of energy, of restlessness, of raw power that had no proper outlet. He exhausted his people with forced labor on the walls of Uruk, which were genuinely magnificent and which he insisted on building taller and more magnificent still. He was aggressive, domineering, overbearing. He challenged every young man in the city to wrestling matches. He exercised what the tablets obliquely but clearly describe as a right of conquest over the people of his city, taking what he wanted, doing as he pleased, answering to no one. The people of Uruk prayed to the gods for help, not to be saved from an enemy, to be saved from their own king. And the gods answered. They asked the goddess Aruru, the creatrix, the one who had fashioned humanity from clay in the beginning, to create a counterpart for Gilgamesh. Someone equal to him in strength, in energy, in wildness. Not to defeat him but to absorb him. To give all that excess power somewhere to go. Aruru took clay. She mixed it with a divine essence. And she shaped it into a man and dropped him in the wilderness. His name was Enkidu. And Enkidu is one of the most remarkable characters in all of ancient literature. He was not a monster. He was not a demon. He was something more interesting than both. He was a man of pure nature. He lived in the open steppe. He ate grass alongside the gazelles. He drank at the watering holes with the animals. He did not know what bread was. He had never seen a city. He was covered in hair. He ran with the herds and, crucially, he protected them, springing the traps that hunters laid, filling in the pits, releasing caught animals. He was, in the language of the ancient Mesopotamians, a wild man. But not in a pejorative sense. He was the world before civilization. The human before the city. The self before the social mask. A hunter reported Enkidu to Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, always hungry for challenge, always searching for something that could match him, sent a woman named Shamhat to the wilderness. Her role in the epic has been debated by scholars for over a century. Some read her with judgment. Others see her as a figure of tremendous agency and wisdom. In the context of the ancient Mesopotamian world, what she represented was the power of civilization itself, specifically the power of human connection, intimacy, and culture to transform the wild into the social. Enkidu spent 6 days and 7 nights with Shamhat at the watering hole. And when it was over, something had shifted. He returned to the animals, and the animals fled from him. He had changed. He could no longer run with them. He was no longer entirely wild. Shamhat looked at him and said something extraordinary. She told him he was now wise, that he had become like a god. She offered him bread and beer, the foundational elements of Mesopotamian civilization, and told him to go to the city. To meet Gilgamesh. Enkidu arrived in Uruk just as Gilgamesh was about to exercise his overwhelming will once again. Enkidu stepped into the doorway and blocked his path. They fought. The tablets describe the fight with the visceral immediacy of someone who had watched wrestling and knew exactly what it looked and felt like. They wrestled through the streets. The doorposts trembled. The walls shook. And eventually, one of them yielded. The translations debate who actually won. Some read it as Gilgamesh, some as a draw. But what the tablets make clear is that whatever happened in the physical contest, what mattered was what happened immediately after. They stopped fighting. They looked at each other. And they embraced. From this moment, they were brothers. The deepest, most complete friendship either of them had ever known. Gilgamesh's restlessness found its outlet not in domination but in a companion who could match him. Enkidu became the thing Gilgamesh had been missing without knowing what was missing. And the city of Uruk breathed again. But Gilgamesh was still Gilgamesh. He was still driven. Still hungry. And now he had someone who could go with him into the impossible. He proposed an adventure that made even the wild Enkidu hesitate. He wanted to travel to the cedar forest, the great forest at the edge of the known world, and kill its guardian. A monstrous being named Humbaba, whose voice was the roar of a flood, whose breath was fire, whose very presence made the cedars shudder. Why? Because Gilgamesh wanted to make a name that would outlast his mortal life. If he could not live forever, he could do something great enough that people would speak of him after he was gone. He had already begun to think about death. He had already started asking the question. Enkidu, who had ranged through the wild lands and knew better than anyone what Humbaba was afraid. He tried to talk Gilgamesh back. The elders of Uruk tried. Even Gilgamesh's mother, the goddess Nin's son, knew she could not stop him. She prayed to the sun god Shamash to protect her son and tied the symbol of her protection around Enkidu's neck, adopting him as her own son, making him family. They made the journey. They reached the cedar forest, which the ancient Mesopotamians described as a sacred and terrifying place where the divine presence was especially heavy in the air. Humbaba came. The battle was fierce and strange and filled with divine assistance from Shamash, who sent great winds from 8 directions to bind the guardian. Humbaba was defeated. He begged for mercy. Gilgamesh hesitated. Enkidu did not. He urged Gilgamesh to strike before the moment passed. The guardian of the cedar forest died. Then something unexpected happened. Something that set in motion the true central tragedy of the entire epic. The goddess Ishtar, the most powerful of the Mesopotamian goddesses, the ruler of love and war, looked down at Gilgamesh returning in triumph from the cedar forest and desired him. She offered herself to him as a lover and a divine consort. She offered him power and glory and abundance beyond imagination. Gilgamesh refused her. And he did not refuse her gently. He recited, in devastating detail, the fates of every lover Ishtar had ever taken. The shepherd she loved and then turned into a wolf, so his own dogs hunted him. The bird she loved and then broke his wing. Tammuz, the god of vegetation, for whom she decreed an annual mourning that is still echoed in agricultural traditions across the ancient Near East. One by one, Gilgamesh named them all and told Ishtar to her face that he wanted no part of what she was offering. This was extraordinarily brave. It was also extraordinarily reckless. Ishtar, humiliated and furious, went to her father Anu, the king of the gods, and demanded the bull of heaven. a divine creature so powerful that each snort of its breath opened chasms in the earth and swallowed hundreds of men. If Anu did not give it to her, she told him, she would break open the gates of the underworld and let the dead outnumber the living. Anu gave her the Bull of Heaven. The Bull of Heaven came to Uruk. It was devastating. One snort and a chasm opened and 100 warriors fell in. A second snort, another chasm, 300 more. On the third snort, Enkidu leaped and grabbed the bull by its horns while Gilgamesh drove his sword behind the horns into the neck. The Bull of Heaven died. Ishtar appeared on the walls of Uruk and raged. And Enkidu did something that sealed his fate. He tore off a haunch of the dead bull and threw it at her. The gods met in council. The killing of Humbaba, the killing of the Bull of Heaven. Someone had to pay. And the one who paid could not be Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, protected by the sun god, favored by fate. The one who paid was Enkidu. He fell ill. He suffered for 12 days. And the tablets record his dying with a tenderness and a grief that reaches across 4,000 years and squeezes the chest of every person who has ever lost someone irreplaceable. In his dying, Enkidu cursed the hunter who had first found him. He cursed Shamhat, who had led him to civilization, to the city, to Gilgamesh. He cursed her bitterly. But the sun god Shamash spoke to him from the sky and reminded him of everything he had been given. The food and clothing and brotherhood. The city and the friendship and the love. And Enkidu, dying, took back the curse. He blessed her instead. And then he was gone. Gilgamesh fell apart. This is the most human moment in the entire epic. This is where the great king, the 2/3 god, the slayer of Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, became simply a man who had lost his best friend and could not understand how the world was still turning. He refused to believe Enkidu was dead for 7 days and 7 nights. He would not allow burial until a maggot fell from Enkidu's nose and he could no longer deny it. Then he left Uruk. He tore off his fine clothing. He put on a lion's skin. He wandered into the wilderness, the same wilderness where Enkidu had once run with the animals. He wept and he walked. Not toward any destination. Just away from the place where Enkidu was not. But the grief transformed into something else as he walked. It transformed into terror. Because for the first time in his life, Gilgamesh was afraid. Not of Humbaba. Not of the Bull of Heaven. Not of Ishtar's anger. He was afraid of the thing that had taken Enkidu. He was afraid of death. His death. The thing that was coming for him eventually, as it had come for his friend. And Gilgamesh decided that he would not accept it. He had heard of a man named Utnapishtim, a mortal man who had been granted eternal life by the gods and placed at the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the world, where time did not touch him the same way. Gilgamesh decided he would find Utnapishtim and learn the secret of immortality. The journey to Utnapishtim was the most treacherous in all of mythology. He had to pass through the mountain of Mashu, the twin-peaked mountain at the edge of the earth, guarded by the scorpion people, beings whose heads touched the sky and whose feet reached the underworld, whose terrible gaze could kill. Gilgamesh looked at them and did not flinch. They let him pass. He walked through the tunnel beneath the mountain for 12 leagues in absolute darkness. No light. No sound. Just the darkness that exists at the boundary of the known world. He walked and walked until the first light appeared and he emerged into a garden of jewels, a garden where the trees bore precious stones as fruit and the light came from everywhere and nowhere. There he met the alewife, the tavern keeper, a woman named Siduri who sat by the sea at the edge of the world, making wine. And she told him something. Something that is among the most beautiful and most debated passages in the entire epic. She told him that when the gods created humanity, they kept death for themselves and gave life to humanity for only a limited time. She told him to eat, drink, be merry, look at the child who holds your hand, let your wife delight in your embrace, for this is the work of humanity. She was offering him the wisdom of acceptance. The wisdom of the present moment. Gilgamesh heard it and walked past it. He wanted more than that. He crossed the waters of death on a boat guided by the ferryman Urshanabi. Using trees he cut himself as punting poles because the waters of death could not be touched and a new pole had to be used for each push. And he found Utnapishtim. He told him everything. His friendship with Enkidu. His grief. His fear. His quest. And Utnapishtim told him the story that changed how scholars understood the ancient world forever. Because Utnapishtim told Gilgamesh about a flood. A great flood, sent by the gods to destroy humanity, from which one righteous man was warned in advance and built a boat and saved his family and the animals. A flood after which the gods placed Utnapishtim and his wife at the ends of the earth and granted them eternal life. This story predates the biblical flood account by at least 1,000 years. When the Assyriologist George Smith first decoded and read aloud this portion of the Gilgamesh tablets in London in 1872, his colleagues said he turned pale and began undressing in the excitement of the moment, so stunned was he by what he was reading. The ancient Mesopotamian flood narrative was almost identical in structure to the story of Noah. The detailed instructions for the boat. The animals brought in pairs. The birds sent out to test whether the waters had receded. The dove. The raven. The mountain where the boat came to rest. The sacrifice offered afterward. These were not coincidences. These were connected traditions, reaching back to a common source lost in the prehistory of human civilization. Utnapishtim challenged Gilgamesh. He told him that if he wanted to understand eternal life, he should first conquer sleep, which is its nearest cousin. Stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh sat down and immediately fell asleep. Utnapishtim's wife baked a loaf of bread for each day he slept. 7 loaves, in various states of staleness and mold, marked the days. When Gilgamesh woke, Utnapishtim showed him the loaves. Gilgamesh had claimed he only closed his eyes for a moment. 7 days had passed. He could not even conquer sleep. How could he conquer death? But Utnapishtim's wife urged compassion. She asked her husband to give Gilgamesh something to take home. And Utnapishtim revealed a secret. At the bottom of the sea there was a plant. A thorny plant, difficult to reach, that could restore youth. It could not grant immortality, but it could restore what time had taken. Gilgamesh dove to the bottom of the sea with stones tied to his feet. He found the plant, cut his hands on its thorns, pulled it free, rose to the surface. He held in his hands the closest thing to eternal life that the mortal world could offer. And then he stopped to rest beside a pool on the journey home. He left the plant on the bank and went into the water to wash. And a serpent smelled the fragrance of the plant, came out of the water, snatched it, and carried it away. As the serpent slid back into the pool, it shed its skin. This, the ancient Mesopotamians explained, is why serpents shed their skin and appear to be reborn. They stole the plant of youth that was meant for humanity. Gilgamesh sat down on the bank and wept. All that way. All those dangers. The darkness, the waters of death, the diving to the bottom of the sea with stones tied to his feet. And a snake had undone it all in a moment. He returned to Uruk without the plant. Without immortality. Without Enkidu. But the ending of the epic is not despair. It is something more mature and more strange. Gilgamesh arrived at the walls of Uruk and spoke to the ferryman who had accompanied him. He told him to look at these walls, to walk along their foundation, to examine their brickwork. These walls were made by the 7 sages. These walls would stand when every person who built them was gone. He was pointing to the city itself, to the thing he had built, the thing he had driven his people to exhaustion over in the arrogant days of his youth, as his answer to the question of mortality. Not the plant. Not immortality. The walls. The city. The story. This very tale, carved into these very tablets, which has been read and retold for 4,000 years and is being spoken aloud right now, today, for you. Gilgamesh found his immortality in exactly the way that every artist and storyteller and builder and maker has ever found it. Not by cheating death. By creating something that outlives the hand that made it. Now let us zoom out, as we always do on Mythology. The flood narrative in Gilgamesh connects to flood traditions in virtually every culture on Earth. The Hindus have the story of Manu, warned by the fish god Matsya of a coming deluge, building a great boat. The Greeks have Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a flood sent by Zeus. The Aztecs had their own flood mythology. The indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica, of North America, of Australia, of sub-Saharan Africa. Virtually every civilization that has ever existed has a story about a great flood that destroyed the old world and from which a few survivors built a new one. Whether this reflects a single ancient event, perhaps the flooding of the Black Sea around 7,000 years ago when the Mediterranean broke through into a freshwater lake in a catastrophic rush of saltwater, or whether it reflects something deeper in the human psyche about destruction and renewal and the fragility of everything we build, is a question that archaeologists and mythologists and geologists continue to debate. And the figure of Enkidu, the wild man who becomes civilized through human connection, who then dies because of it, is one of the most sophisticated explorations of what civilization costs that any culture has ever produced. Enkidu was free in the wilderness. He was also alone. He gained friendship, brotherhood, love, bread, beer, poetry. He also gained mortality, consequence, the gods' attention, and ultimately death. The epic does not say the trade was wrong. It simply shows us what the trade is, with unflinching honesty. The question of what we trade for civilization, for connection, for belonging, for being part of a human community rather than running wild alone, is not an ancient question. It is the question of every single person who has ever learned to love another human being and therefore learned to fear losing them. Gilgamesh loved Enkidu. And when Enkidu died, Gilgamesh experienced something that, if you have ever lost a person who was the center of your world, you will recognize immediately. The feeling that reality itself has been rewired incorrectly. That the world is running on the wrong operating system. That something fundamental has been subtracted that was supposed to be permanent. He went looking for a way to undo it. He walked to the edge of the universe with his grief in his hands, asking the oldest question. He came back without the answer he wanted. But he came back. And on the long walk home, carrying nothing but his empty hands and his full grief, he found something that the ancient Mesopotamians, for 1,700 years ago, understood about the human condition that we are still learning. The walls of Uruk are still there. Not the actual walls, though archaeologists have found them. The story is still there. Gilgamesh is still there. Carved into clay. Baked by ancient suns. Buried for 2,000 years. Dug up. Decoded. Read aloud in a British lecture hall in 1872, causing a man to take off his coat in astonishment. And spoken here, today for you. This is the immortality that was always available. Not the plant at the bottom of the sea. This, the story, the voice that carries it, the ear that receives it, the mind that holds it, and passes it on. This has been episode 3 of Sarah Mythology. We began at the walls of a city that was the first city, and we followed the first hero ever named in human writing to the edge of the universe and back. We sat with his grief and his fear and his impossible courage. And we found, buried in the oldest story on earth, a truth about mortality that is still the most honest thing anyone has ever said about it. Next time we cross into West Africa, to the Yoruba tradition, one of the most sophisticated cosmological systems ever developed by any civilization on earth. We meet the Orishas, the divine beings who shape the human world, and we find a story about creation that will change the way you understand the nature of the gods. Gilgamesh walked to the end of the world and came home. So can we. See you at the next fire.